Hi guys, so what I've done is I've rendered out those two drone passes we were talking about, and then I've also set up a mantra to set up a render for the environment. So nothing major going on here, and as I showed you before, the environment is basically has just a simple gray shader on it, and it'll be using all the same lights. So in here you can just see I've put the drone as a phantom, and I've excluded any objects that have effects in the name. Other than that, it's just the same. Everything is a candidate, and all the lights are there except for the OpenGL light. And that's it. So basic render for the environment, and I'll jump through to the comp. And this is what the raw environment render is looking like. So I felt like that was a little bit too dark, so I've just color corrected it here in comp and boosted it up a little bit, and also added some more saturation to the colors. So I didn't want it to just be completely blue feeling, which it felt like here, so I've just added some more saturation so we have something to work with, bearing in mind that the drone itself I'm planning to have quite blue, the whole effect. So that's what I've got for the environment, and then I have my two drone passes. So this is the drone itself with our emissive extras. And here is the hexagon render. And for now, I've just done this render with no drone as a matte, because I actually really like seeing the inside, and it's quite dark, so I'm just going to color correct these up so we can see. So that's the rendered version of the hexagons, and I'm pretty happy with that. I think one of the first things we'll do moving into the second week of this effect is add something inside. Because now that I've gone for this more internal view instead of just viewing the surface, I feel like it's lacking something interesting going on inside. I mean, obviously you get to see some hexagons moving around, which is pretty cool. But it'd be good to kind of highlight some of those areas with something else more interesting. But in terms of the motion and the fall off and everything, I'm pretty happy with this. So now comes the tricky part of how we merge and mask between this render and this one. So it's going to be a bit of a fine balancing act here, and I might even struggle to try and do this live in one go, because it becomes a confusing puzzle with different bitmaps. And if I'm right in saying in Nuke you'd basically be shuffling out some of these layers and then using grades or something like that to subtract basically the mask layer, to have that subtract the layer underneath. So in Fusion we'll be using bitmaps and channel booleans to do most of those operations. So for starters, let me duplicate our geometry here and make sure that for the drone we need to extract the emission, which means we need to rebuild the drone itself with no emission. So if I come over here and in the loader, in format, I can change which channels this loader is looking for. And so I want direct diffuse RGMB. It's actually very subtle in this case because it's a highly reflective shader. So let me get rid of that. And we need direct reflect. and we need indirect reflect. Okay, so that should be all we need. So I'm just going to boolean these. I'll start with the diffuse, and then I'll just add the reflection layers on top. So we don't need alpha. We have that in our diffuse layer there. So we'll add on our direct reflect and our indirect here. And it's kind of cool rebuilding this in here anyway, because then we have control. So if I wanted to boost the indirect, which at the moment is slightly noisy, but I mean we can bring up that area of the drone if we want to, or increase our direct reflect here, just make it pop a bit more. So at the moment there we've rebuilt it, and now it doesn't have any emission. So I'll duplicate this again. And here we'll choose our emission. So you can see there is our whole render, and here is just the passes we need to rebuild it. Here is our emission separately. And then I also need the all-important mask. So how do I get that? I just choose our mask AOV here. Okay. So first things first, we need to remove this drone where we don't want it. So once again, I'll put a boolean in here. Plug that into the mask and subtract. And then I have to change what it's using to subtract and use luminance. And for now, I'm just going to plug this on a background so we can see it a bit better. Just so we can see exactly what the mask is doing. So here basically we're taking that and we have this mask and we're just removing where that mask is and just keeping what's not being masked out. And you can see our mask here isn't quite matching the edges of our drone there, so we shouldn't be seeing anything. And there you can see it as well if I look at the alpha. So I can just put down a bitmap over here and try and squeeze as much as I can out of this range. And I've just done that to the alpha, so I think what I want, because we put a bitmap down, I've basically converted the whole thing to an alpha anyway. So I'll put luminance in there, but if we look at the alpha, it's updated to match the luminance, so that works as well. So I'll just try and get as much as I can there. There we go. So there's our main drone revealing itself there based on our mask. And I need to merge in our emission as well. So I don't know where this bitmap comes from. So I can take our emission and we can add it on to one of these layers. So really completely rebuilding the whole drone in the comp here. So we add our emission on, do nothing with the alpha, then we add our direct reflection and our indirect. And here we have our mask. So the thing is now, because the emission is completely separate, I can apply this mask in a similar way to the emission itself without needing to do exactly the same thing. So the problem here is, yes, we are revealing the drone, but the emissive parts of the drone shouldn't be emissive all the time. That somehow also needs to fade on and off based on that mask value. So let's take this bitmap here and see what we can do. We also have the alpha. So just trying to think of something here. This is where it's going to start getting a little bit messy as I move stuff around. So here's our mask there. Here's our alpha. Put down another bitmap, and I actually want to soften this. So I can just put a soft edge on here and then use our alpha from our main render, which I need to convert to a bitmap first. Plug that in as a mask to our blurred bitmap and hit minimum. So here we've taken our mask and we've softened it further back into the drone, and I've managed that just by then taking that soft mask and masking itself by the alpha of the drone. So we can have something a little bit soft over there. We'll just try to clean this up a little bit. And then we take our emission and we subtract by our nice new blurred mask, and we have to invert that. So here I'm eventually removing the emission pass by a blurry version of the same mask that's removing the drone itself. So if I didn't do that, we'd have emission forever. So I do that, I'm doing this. If I use the same mask I'm using for the drone, you would never see emission. So I've softened that mask up, and I have some control here now to blend that emission layer back, but it will still eventually fade off. So at some point, once we have the hexagon pattern moving over, I'll need to adjust just how visible that those emission layers are on top of our drone over here. So I can do all sorts of things like increase the softness, even clamp how bright that value is, I guess with a second bitmap. And you can very quickly see how this is going to turn into a jumble of bitmaps here to try and figure out the best use of these masks from the render. But you see I can boost that. So I think that's actually worked quite nicely. And something else we can do, let me just save, is actually we have that leading edge. we know where the front of the mask is. It's over here. So I can try and add that as a brightening effect down here. So say I put down a color corrector, and maybe I take this mask and this one, where am I? This one over here. And we have this blurred one. And we just add them together. And I can dim this one down. So we still have a bright main one and then a slightly blurred one on top. Come over here and use that just to brighten up our edges. So I could remove that, and you see we just brighten up really close to the edge there based on that mask. And I just include some of this one here. So I'm going to put one more in to manage that. Could use something that's not quite as blurred to get a much sharper edge. So I'm just trying to figure out the best way for me to do that. And actually I could just blur this one slightly as well. So if I disable and enable that, you can see we're just kind of sticking to one point here. And as we're getting brighter, this shouldn't stay as saturated, so I'll use this color corrector to also desaturate the highlights a little bit. And I'm not quite getting that range. I think it's because my mask is slightly blurred, so I could save that for our grade, or maybe over here just before we do a glow. So the reason being, I'm still trying to adjust my highlight saturation based on this mask. So that's not a strong mask there to try and adjust highlights, so I'll just do that in a separate color corrector that's not confined by that mask there. So there we get a slight extra boost on the leading edge, slightly less saturated, and still a nice blurry fall off to that emission. So let's bring in our environment quickly. So you can see this is potentially a disastrous mess of a puzzle. If you go through it slowly, and if it's not making sense, just try and redo it again and think very logically about what passes you need exactly to subtract from and what you'd like to add together. And it can take a few attempts and get quite confusing, but at the end it should be fine. It's not some kind of science, you just need to balance these layers here and figure it out. I'm getting a weird reintroduction of the mask there at the end. So I think at some point I need to fade that off. So I can just key our main mask over here. So as soon as the drone's finished revealing itself, I'm going to key off our Boolean. And the same thing's happening to our emission, but I kind of like it. So that's our main drone revealing itself, and we will need to come back and tweak these values once I get the hexagon pattern on. But before that, I also want to do something quickly for the invisibility effect. So the effect the drone has on the environment. So let's take this drone render again. And grab the normal. So you can see the normal pass has the environment and everything in it, but the alpha is still just the drone. So all I need to do is either shuffle that out or use a Boolean, or in this case take the loader itself and under import post multiply by alpha. Right, so a few things we can do here. Firstly, I usually use this pass to try and get my Fresnel type effect. So I'll use blue. Try and find that value. I'm just going to grab one of these layers to use as an alpha. Actually, I have this one. Okay, so because I'm subtracting the alpha, I'm getting the inverse of the value I had before. So if I plug this in and subtract it so that I'm only left with the drone, I can invert this bitmap and get back to where I was. So there's my Fresnel type effect. And I can also grab my, say, my two reflection passes here. So my idea is to have some of the drone slightly visible, so I can use these reflections add these together. And then make sure that I'm only taking the reflections on the very glancing edge. So only there. Just going to color correct this down a bit. It only needs to be very subtle. And we can merge that onto the background. And let me burn that in because I don't want to see any of these dark areas here. Right, so that gives us something slightly visible. Might need to be more subtle than that. Can always play with these settings. Make sure we're getting just a little highlight. So I think that works fine. And then obviously I can also take the normal. Now I want this to be, I'm going to move some stuff around here. Take the normal and plug it straight into a displace. And because it's the normal, we have a red and a green. Instead of using radial, I can use the X and Y value and set these to red and green. And that means I can refract in just X and refract on Y as well. So using the normal pass, I can get a pretty decent fake refraction going on in this environment. So we need something pretty subtle, just a slight refraction, and then we have our merged on reflection, which is just adding a little highlight of visibility there. And another thing I like to do, especially when using refraction, is just defocus whatever the object is, defocus the refracted area slightly. So I'm actually going to use this alpha, and I'll put in a defocus. And you see we'll just blur that. So nothing crazy, but just something subtle. And our reflection goes on top, and we displace all of that stuff. So now we get a pretty convincing example of an invisible or cloaked object. And then obviously our actual drone appears using our mask. So we get our beat there of invisibility, and then the drone appears. So I'm going to end this video here, and I think I might have gone through it quite quickly, but I wasn't actually expecting all my masks to do exactly what I wanted. So either watch it again if it was a bit too quick, or I encourage you just to kind of dive into the comp and mess around and really try for yourself to get these masks to work in a way that you want them to. For this effect, it's definitely going to start getting quite difficult to visualize the network and how I've made it work. So it's better to just understand for yourself sort of logically what you need these render passes to do, than to try and follow exactly the methodology that I've put down here. But I think it's pretty clear in terms of the passes we have and what I needed them to do to bring them together to get this far. So I'll end this one here, and we'll start the next one and get the hexagon render to work and play nicely with our drone. So I'll see you then.